In 1925, a journalist named H.L. Mencken sat down at his typewriter in Baltimore and punched out a phrase that would define an entire region of the United States for the next century. He called it the Bible Belt. He meant it as an insult. He was covering the Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee, where a school teacher named John Scopes was on trial for the crime of teaching evolution. Mencken looked at the sweating crowds, the revival tents, the fire and brimstone preachers shouting about damnation under the brutal southern sun, and he thought he understood the South. He thought it would never change. He was wrong. Not entirely wrong, of course. For nearly 100 years after Mencken coined that term, the Bible Belt held firm. It stretched from the Carolinas through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and deep into the heart of Texas. Church attendance in these states dwarfed the national average. On any given Sunday morning, highways would slow to a crawl as families in their finest clothes made their way to white steepled buildings on every other street corner. In some counties, there were more churches than gas stations. In 2000, a Gallup poll found that over 70% of adults in Mississippi said they attended church weekly. In Alabama, it was 65%. These numbers were staggering compared to states like Vermont or Oregon, where weekly attendance hovered around 20%. The Bible Belt wasn't just a cultural identity, it was a statistical reality. But something has been happening, something that would have made Mencken's jaw drop. Not because the Bible Belt is becoming what he wanted, but because it is becoming something nobody predicted. Churches across the South, institutions that stood like granite for generations, are quietly and sometimes loudly abandoning beliefs that their grandparents would have considered non-negotiable. And the reasons are far more complicated than anyone wants to admit. Let's start with a number that shook the entire American religious establishment. In 2006, the Southern Baptist Convention, the single largest Protestant denomination in the United States, and the undisputed heavyweight champion of Bible Belt Christianity, reported 16.3 million members. That was their peak. By 2022, that number had fallen to 13.2 million. That's a loss of over 3 million members in 16 years. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the entire population of Iowa just vanishing from the pews. And the Southern Baptists weren't alone. The United Methodist Church, which had been the second largest Protestant denomination in the country, lost nearly a quarter of its American congregations between 2019 and 2024, largely because of a schism over whether to affirm same-sex marriages and ordain openly gay clergy. Over 7,000 Methodist churches voted to leave the denomination during that period, and most of them were in the South. But here's the twist that most people miss. The story isn't just about people leaving churches. It's also about the churches that stayed and decided to change. Before I go further, I want to pause for a moment. If you're watching this and you're fascinated by stories that dig beneath the surface of history and culture, that's exactly what we do here on Professor Archive. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. And while you're at it, drop a comment and tell me what profession are you in and what time is it where you're watching right now. I'm genuinely curious about the kind of people who are drawn to these deep dives. All right, let's keep going. To understand why Bible Belt churches are shifting, you have to understand what they were shifting from. For most of the 20th century, Southern evangelical Christianity rested on a set of core convictions that functioned almost like load-bearing walls. Remove one, and the whole structure trembled. These included the inerrancy of Scripture, meaning the Bible was without error in every detail. They included a strict complementarian view of gender roles, meaning women could not serve as pastors or hold authority over men in the church. They included a firm stance that homosexuality was sinful in all circumstances. They included young earth creationism, the belief that God created the universe in 6 literal days, roughly 6 to 10,000 years ago, and they included a theology of eternal conscious torment, meaning that people who did not accept Jesus Christ as their personal Savior would burn in hell forever. These weren't fringe positions. These were the mainstream. The 1963 Baptist Faith and Message, which served as the doctrinal standard for the Southern Baptist Convention, codified many of these positions. The 2000 revision went even further, explicitly stating that the office of pastor was restricted to men and declaring that a wife should submit herself graciously to the leadership of her husband. For decades, questioning any of these positions in a Southern church was roughly equivalent to questioning gravity. You could do it, but people would look at you like you'd lost your mind, and you might lose your job. So, what changed? The first crack appeared in a place nobody expected. It appeared in the megachurches. Starting in the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, a new breed of Southern church began to emerge. These were enormous, often meeting in converted warehouses or purpose-built campuses that looked more like corporate headquarters than traditional houses of worship. They had coffee bars and rock bands and fog machines, and they attracted young people by the thousands. Churches like North Point Community Church in Alpharetta, Georgia, founded by Andy Stanley in 1995, began to pioneer what some called a seeker-sensitive approach. The idea was simple but revolutionary for the Bible Belt. Instead of assuming everyone who walked through the door already believed the Bible was true, these churches started by meeting people where they were. Stanley, the son of famous televangelist Charles Stanley, became one of the most influential pastors in America, and he did it by saying things that made traditional Southern Baptists deeply uncomfortable. In 2018, he told his congregation that Christians needed to unhitch from the Old Testament, arguing that the foundation of Christianity should be the resurrection of Jesus, not the entirety of the Hebrew Scriptures. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Albert Mohler, the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, publicly rebuked Stanley. But here's what mattered. Stanley's church didn't shrink, it grew. By 2023, North Point Ministries was drawing over 30,000 people on a typical weekend across its multiple campuses. The people were voting with their feet, and they were walking toward something new. But the megachurch shift was only the surface. Beneath it, a much deeper transformation was underway, driven by forces that no pastor or denomination could control. The first of these forces was the internet. This might sound obvious, but its impact on Bible Belt religion cannot be overstated. Before the internet, if you grew up in a small town in rural Alabama, your entire theological worldview was shaped by a remarkably small number of people. Your parents, your pastor, maybe a Sunday school teacher, or a professor at a local Christian college. If your pastor told you the earth was 6,000 years old, you had very limited access to credible counter-arguments. The local library might have a few books by skeptics, but you probably weren't going to read them because everyone in town would see what you checked out. The internet obliterated that information monopoly overnight. Suddenly, a teenager in Tupelo, Mississippi, could watch a lecture by a Yale theologian explaining the documentary hypothesis of the Pentateuch. A young mother in Fort Worth could find an online community of former evangelicals processing their doubts. A seminary student in Louisville could read peer-reviewed papers on the historical Jesus that contradicted everything his professors were teaching. The Pew Research Center tracked this transformation meticulously. In 2007, they found that 16% of Americans identified as religiously unaffiliated, the so-called known as. By 2021, that number had skyrocketed to 29%. Among adults under 30, it was even higher, approaching 40%. And crucially, this trend wasn't happening only in liberal coastal cities. It was happening in the Bible Belt too. Between 2007 and 2021, the share of adults in the South who identified as Protestant dropped from 54% to 43%. The Bible Belt was thinning. The second force was generational change. The baby boomers who built the megachurches and the Gen Xers who filled them were giving way to millennials and Gen Z. And these younger generations had a fundamentally different relationship with authority and tradition. A landmark study by the Public Religion Research Institute in 2023 found that 69% of Americans aged 18 to 29 supported same-sex marriage. Even among young white evangelicals, the most conservative religious demographic in the country, support had climbed to 47%. This was a seismic shift. Pastors across the Bible Belt found themselves caught in a vice. On one side, their denominational leadership demanded adherence to traditional positions. On the other, their own children and grandchildren were telling them those positions were cruel and outdated. Many chose to stay quiet, preaching sermons that carefully avoided the most divisive topics. Researchers at Baylor University, a Baptist institution in Texas, documented this phenomenon in a 2019 study. They found that Southern Baptist pastors were significantly less likely to preach about homosexuality than they had been in the 1990s, despite the fact that their denomination's official position hadn't changed. The silence itself was a form of change. But some churches didn't stay silent. Some dove headfirst into transformation. Grace Point Church in Nashville, Tennessee, is perhaps the most dramatic example. Founded as a conservative evangelical congregation, Grace Point began to evolve under the leadership of Pastor Stan Mitchell. In 2015, Mitchell stood before his congregation and announced that the church would fully affirm and welcome LGBTQ individuals, including performing same-sex marriages. He knew what it would cost. Within weeks, the church lost over 80% of its membership. 80%. The congregation went from over 1,000 members to around 200. Mitchell later described it as the most painful experience of his life. But then something remarkable happened. The church began to grow again. New members arrived, people who had felt excluded from Southern Christianity for years, sometimes decades. By 2020, Grace Point had rebuilt to over 500 regular attendees and had become a symbol of a new kind of Southern faith. And Grace Point wasn't alone. Across the Bible Belt, similar stories were playing out. Highland Church of Christ in Abilene, Texas, one of the largest churches of Christ in the world, announced in 2023 that it would begin allowing women to serve in expanded leadership roles, including some forms of public teaching. This was a massive departure for a denomination that had historically interpreted the Apostle Paul's letters as an absolute prohibition on women speaking in church. The decision wasn't made lightly. It came after years of study, debate, and prayer, and it cost them. Several hundred members left, but the church's leadership believed they were following the trajectory of Scripture rather than clinging to a single verse in isolation. This brings us to one of the most fascinating intellectual shifts happening in Bible Belt Christianity, a shift in how people read the Bible itself. For generations, the dominant approach in Southern churches was what scholars call a flat reading. Every verse carried equal weight. A passage from Leviticus was as binding as a teaching of Jesus. A verse from Paul's letter to Timothy was as authoritative as the Sermon on the Mount. This approach had the advantage of simplicity, but it created enormous problems because the Bible, as anyone who has actually read it cover to cover knows, contains passages that are wildly difficult to reconcile with each other. It contains commands to stone disobedient children and commands to love your enemies. It contains passages that seem to endorse slavery and passages that declare all humans equal before God. Say, for decades, Southern churches managed these contradictions through a system of theological gymnastics, explaining why some Old Testament laws were ceremonial and no longer binding while others were moral and eternally valid. But younger Christians started asking uncomfortable questions. Why is the prohibition on homosexuality in Leviticus still binding, but the prohibition on eating shellfish is not? Why do we take Paul's statements about women literally, but treat his instructions about head coverings as culturally conditioned? These questions didn't have easy answers, and many pastors, trained in seminaries that discouraged this kind of questioning, didn't have good ones. A growing number of Bible Belt Christians began to adopt what theologians call a Christocentric hermeneutic, a method of reading the Bible that places the life and teachings of Jesus at the center and interprets everything else through that lens. This meant that when an Old Testament passage seemed to contradict the character of Jesus, Jesus won. When Paul appeared to restrict women, but Jesus elevated them, Jesus took priority. This wasn't actually a new approach. It had deep roots in Christian tradition going back to the early church fathers. But for Bible Belt Christianity, where the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it, had been the unofficial creed for a century, it felt revolutionary. Now, I need to be honest about something. Not everyone in the Bible Belt is changing. The story I've been telling is real, but it's only part of the picture. For every church that liberalizes, another doubles down. The Southern Baptist Convention, after years of internal turmoil, moved decisively to the right in 2023 when it voted to expel Saddleback Church, the megachurch founded by Rick Warren, because it had ordained women as pastors. Saddleback was one of the most famous churches in America. Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life, had sold over 50 million copies, and the SBC kicked them out. The same convention also expelled other churches that had taken steps toward gender equality in pastoral leadership. This was not a denomination moving toward moderation. It was drawing a harder line. And in 2024, the SBC went further, voting on an amendment to its constitution that would explicitly bar churches with any female pastors, not just senior pastors, but any female staff member with the title of pastor. The amendment required ratification at the following year's convention, and it revealed just how deep the fault lines had become. The Bible Belt wasn't simply liberalizing, it was fracturing. And the fracture was happening along a very specific line, the line between those who believed faithfulness required holding firm and those who believed faithfulness required moving forward. This fracture had profound consequences for a topic that had haunted Southern Christianity for centuries: race. The Southern Baptist Convention was literally founded in 1845 over the issue of slavery. Southern Baptists split from their northern counterparts because they wanted to appoint slaveholders as missionaries. For 150 years, that original sin cast a shadow over the denomination. It wasn't until 1995, 150 years after its founding, that the SBC formally apologized for its role in supporting slavery and racism, and even that apology was contested. Many Black Christians across the South viewed it as too little, too late. By the 2020s, race had become one of the most explosive issues in Bible Belt churches. The murder of George Floyd in May 2020 sent shockwaves through American society, and those shockwaves hit Southern churches hard. Some pastors preached about racial justice, calling their congregations to reckon with the legacy of slavery and segregation. Others pushed back fiercely, arguing that critical race theory, a framework from legal academia, was infiltrating the church and undermining biblical authority. The conflict became so intense that several prominent black pastors and leaders left the Southern Baptist Convention entirely. Charlie Dates, the pastor of Progressive Baptist Church in Chicago, who had strong ties to Southern evangelicalism, publicly severed those ties in 2020. Dwight McKissick, a prominent black Southern Baptist pastor in Texas, repeatedly clashed with denominational leadership over their unwillingness to address racism. And perhaps most dramatically, Russell Moore, the president of the SBC's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission and one of the most prominent evangelical voices in America, resigned in 2021 after years of conflict with denominational leaders over race, politics, and the handling of sexual abuse cases. Moore later wrote that he had been called the godless leftist by other Southern Baptist leaders simply for acknowledging that racism was sinful and that the church had a responsibility to address it. His departure was a watershed moment. If Russell Moore, a deeply conservative theologian by any standard outside of the SBC, was too liberal for the denomination, it said something profound about where the denomination was heading. And then there was politics. The entanglement of Bible Belt Christianity with partisan politics, specifically with the Republican Party, had been building for decades. It started in earnest in 1979 when Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority, explicitly linking evangelical Christianity with conservative political causes. It accelerated through the Reagan years, the culture wars of the 1990s, the George W. Bush era, and it reached a fever pitch with the rise of Donald Trump. Trump's relationship with Bible Belt Christianity was, by any historical standard, bizarre. He was a thrice-married former casino owner who had been caught on tape bragging about sexual assault. He couldn't name a favorite Bible verse when asked. He held a Bible upside down for a photo opportunity outside a tear-gassed church. And yet, in 2016, 81% of white evangelicals voted for him. In 2020, that number barely budged, dropping only to 76%. This alliance bewildered many observers, but it also created a crisis within Bible Belt churches. A growing number of Christians, particularly younger ones, began to feel that their faith had been hijacked by a political movement. They saw pastors who preached about the sanctity of life on Sunday, but cheered policies that separated immigrant children from their parents on Monday. They saw churches that claimed to follow the Prince of Peace, but displayed an almost gleeful enthusiasm for military aggression. They saw a religion that was supposed to be about loving your neighbor, weaponized into a tool for demonizing the other. The data reflected this disillusionment. A 2022 Pew Research study found that the single largest reason young Americans gave for leaving Christianity was not intellectual doubt. It was the perception that the church was too focused on politics. 38% of former Christians under 30 cited the political involvement of religious leaders as a major factor in their decision to leave. In the Bible Belt specifically, this created a peculiar dynamic. Young people weren't necessarily abandoning faith itself. They were abandoning the particular expression of faith they had grown up with. Many drifted toward non-denominational churches that avoided overt political messaging. Others joined progressive congregations like Grace Point or Wild Goose Festival communities. Some left organized religion entirely, but still described themselves as spiritual. And some, a significant number, simply moved away. The brain drain from the Bible Belt, the phenomenon of educated young people leaving the South for cities in the Northeast, West Coast, or Pacific Northwest, had a religious dimension that is often overlooked. When a young person from Montgomery, Alabama moves to Portland, Oregon, they don't just change their zip code. They change their spiritual ecosystem. They move from a place where church attendance is the default to a place where it is the exception. And many never go back. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because even as some Bible Belt churches liberalize and others harden, a third path is emerging, and it might be the most important one of all. Across the South, a growing number of churches are attempting something that previous generations would have considered impossible. They're trying to hold theological tension without resolving it. They're saying, we don't all agree on these issues, and we're going to stay together anyway. Northland Church in Longwood, Florida, is one example. After years as a conservative Baptist megachurch, Northland began to describe itself as a multi-generational, multi-site, multicultural church that welcomed people across the theological spectrum. They didn't issue a statement affirming or condemning same-sex relationships. They just said, come and figure it out together. Church of the Highlands in Birmingham, Alabama, the largest church in the state with over 60,000 regular attendees, has also navigated this space carefully, maintaining evangelical theology while quietly stepping back from the most inflammatory culture war rhetoric. Their pastor, Chris Hodges, has focused on practical community engagement, fighting poverty, building schools, and providing social services, rather than on the doctrinal battles that have consumed so many Southern churches. This pragmatic approach, focusing on what a church does rather than on what it officially believes about contested issues, is becoming increasingly common. And it represents a genuine innovation in the history of Bible Belt Christianity, which has traditionally been defined by its certainty. Let me take you to one more story, because I think it captures something essential about this moment. In 2019, a woman named Beth Moore, perhaps the most famous female Bible teacher in the history of the Southern Baptist Convention, posted a tweet. It said, "I am a complementarian, but I do find some things curious." She went on to describe attending an event where a male seminary student had been chosen to speak over her, a woman with decades of experience and millions of books sold, simply because he was male. The response from some corners of the SBC was vicious. John MacArthur, a prominent pastor, was asked during a recorded event to respond to the name Beth Moore with one word. He said, "Go home." The audience laughed. It was a turning point. Moore, who had spent her entire career within the conservative evangelical world, who had been one of Lifeway Christian Store's best-selling authors for years, began to push back publicly against sexism, racism, and political corruption within the SBC. In 2021, she announced that she was leaving the Southern Baptist Convention entirely. Her departure was not just personal, it was symbolic. Beth Moore was, for millions of Southern Baptist women, the voice that had helped them understand the Bible. She led Bible studies in living rooms across the South. Her workbooks were dog-eared and highlighted in homes from Virginia to Texas, and she was saying, "I can't do this anymore." Not because she had lost her faith, but because she believed the institution had lost its way. The departure of figures like Moore, Russell Moore, no relation, and many others has created a remarkable situation. The institutions of Bible Belt Christianity are, in many cases, moving to the right, even as the people in the pews are moving in more diverse directions. The gap between official denominational positions and the actual beliefs of churchgoers is wider than it has ever been. A 2023 survey by Lifeway Research, the research arm of the Southern Baptist Convention itself, found that a significant minority of SBC churchgoers held views that contradicted their denomination's official positions. 28% believed that the Bible should not be taken literally in all cases. 34% believed that God accepts the worship of all religions. These were not fringe findings. They represented millions of people sitting in Southern Baptist pews every Sunday, singing the hymns, putting money in the offering plate, and quietly disagreeing with what they were being told. This disconnect is not sustainable. History tells us that when institutions diverge too far from their members, one of two things happens. Either the institution reforms, or the members leave. In the case of Bible Belt Christianity, both are happening simultaneously, and the result is a religious landscape that is more diverse, more fragmented, and more uncertain than at any point since the region earned its famous nickname. The United Methodist split alone reshaped the map of Southern Christianity. When the denomination officially lifted its ban on same-sex marriage and openly LGBTQ clergy in 2024, thousands of conservative congregations had already departed to form the Global Methodist Church. Most of these departing congregations were in the South. But many Methodist churches in the South chose to stay, affirming the denomination's new direction. The result was that two Methodist churches, one traditional and one progressive, might now sit just miles apart in the same small southern town. Neighbors who had worshiped together for decades suddenly found themselves in different denominations. There's a theological concept called the Overton window, borrowed from political science, that describes the range of ideas considered acceptable in public discourse. For Bible Belt Christianity, that window has shifted dramatically in the past 20 years. Positions that would have been unthinkable in a Southern church in 2000, women as lead pastors, affirmation of LGBTQ members, acceptance of evolutionary science, openness to interfaith dialogue, these are now held by a substantial minority of Southern Christians and a majority of younger ones. That doesn't mean these positions are dominant. They're not. The Bible Belt is still the most religiously conservative region in the United States. Church attendance in Mississippi and Alabama is still roughly double the national average. But the monolith has cracked. The idea that the South is a single uniform block of conservative Christianity is no longer true, if it ever was. And maybe that's the most important thing to understand. The Bible Belt was never quite as uniform as outsiders believed. Even in its most conservative eras, there were dissenting voices. There were progressive churches in the South long before the term progressive Christianity existed. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization that powered the civil rights movement, was, as its name suggests, Christian and Southern. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister from Atlanta. The black church tradition in the South has always operated on a different theological wavelength than the white evangelical mainstream, emphasizing liberation, justice, and communal care in ways that challenge the status quo. What's happening now is not entirely new, but it is happening at a scale and speed that is unprecedented. The question that hangs over all of this is simple but profound. What will the Bible Belt look like in 20 years? Will it still exist as a recognizable cultural entity? Some scholars believe it will. They point to the deep roots of evangelical Christianity in Southern soil, the way it is woven into family identity, community life, and regional culture. You don't undo 200 years of tradition in a generation. Others believe the belt is fraying beyond repair, that the combination of demographic change, generational shift, and cultural transformation will eventually make the South look more like the rest of America, diverse, fragmented, and largely secular. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The Bible Belt will likely continue to be more religious than the rest of the country, but the nature of that religion will be different. It will be less uniform, less certain, and less willing to speak with a single voice. The era of the Southern Church as the unchallenged center of community life may be ending, but faith in the South is not dying. It is mutating. It is adapting. It is doing what religious movements have always done in the face of change. It is evolving. And there is a deep irony in that word. A century after Mencken sat in Dayton, Tennessee, and mocked Southerners for rejecting evolution, the Bible Belt is proving that evolution, the slow, messy, often painful process of adaptation and change, applies to everything, even to the institutions that once denied it. If you made it this far, you're clearly someone who values depth and nuance, and that's exactly the kind of viewer we love here on Professor Archive. If this video gave you something to think about, consider hitting that super thanks button below. It directly supports the work that goes into these deep dives, and it means the world. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.